She was the laughingstock of the entire neighborhood. They called her paranoid. They called her home a concrete eyesore. But when the skies turned a violently bruised purple, and the mountain literally began to tear itself apart, those same mocking neighbors would be begging to get inside. Here is the true story of Beatrice Gallagher. The affluent community of Crestview Valley was the kind of place where lawns were manicured with military precision, and houses were towering testaments to modern wealth. Nestled at the base of the towering Blackwood Ridge in the Pacific Northwest, it was a postcard-perfect town. Everyone knew everyone, and more importantly, everyone knew everyone's business. So, when Beatrice Gallagher bought Lot 42 UGG, the neighborhood gossip mill went into overdrive. Lot 42 was considered unbuildable by most. It was a steep, jagged slice of land aggressively sloped into the side of the ridge. For years it had sat empty, a wild patch of pine and granite looming over the pristine cul-de-sacs below. Beatrice was a 62-year-old retired structural engineer. She didn't drive a luxury SUV, and she didn't attend the country club mixers. She drove a battered 2010 Ford F-150, wore steel-toed boots, and carried rolls of architectural blueprints wherever she went. The trouble began the day the excavators arrived. Richard Henderson, the self-appointed king of the neighborhood watch and owner of a sprawling 6-bedroom colonial directly beneath Lot 42, was the first to complain. He marched up the dirt path, expecting to see a foundation being laid for a nice, sensible, split-level home. Instead, he saw heavy machinery violently carving a massive, cavernous hole directly into the hillside. "Excuse me," Richard had shouted over the roar of the diesel engines cornering Beatrice as she reviewed a topographic map. "What on earth are you doing? You're ruining the natural grade. And where's your timber delivery? You can't just leave a crater." Beatrice had looked at him, her expression completely unreadable. "I'm not building a traditional house, Richard. I'm building an earth-berm structure. We anchor into the bedrock tomorrow." Within a week, the whispers in Crestview Valley turned into a roar of mockery. Beatrice wasn't building a house. She was building a bunker. Instead of elegant bay windows and cedar siding, massive trucks poured thousands of gallons of industrial-grade, steel-reinforced concrete into the hillside. She installed geothermal heating loops deep into the earth. The front of the house, the only part visible to the street, was fitted with thick, blast-resistant polycarbonate windows and heavy steel shutters that looked like they belonged on a military compound. Chloe and Dave Whitmore, a young, trendy couple who lived 2 doors down, made Beatrice the punchline of their dinner parties. "Have you seen the Doomsday Dungeon?" Dave laughed one evening, swirling his expensive Merlot. "I swear, I saw her installing a filtration system that could survive a nuclear winter. Property values are going to plummet. Who wants to live next to a paranoid hermit?" They relentlessly mocked her. Teenagers threw eggs at her steel shutters. Someone even planted a mock fallout shelter sign at the base of her driveway. But Beatrice never retaliated. She just kept building. She worked closely with her foreman, a rugged, no-nonsense contractor named Tom Sullivan, ensuring every retaining wall was over-engineered by a factor of 3. When Tom asked her why she was spending triple the budget on structural steel, Beatrice paused, her eyes darkening. 30 years ago, Tom, I lived in a beautiful standard coat house in the Midwest, Beatrice said softly, the only time she ever showed vulnerability. My husband was inside. I will never ever put my life in the hands of drywall and 2x4s again. This mountain is beautiful, but it is not our friend. Tom never questioned her again. By the end of the year, the cabin, as Beatrice stubbornly called it, was finished. To the untrained eye, it was bizarre. The roof was entirely covered in turf and native grasses, blending seamlessly into the slope of the hill. Only the brutalist concrete facade and the heavy steel door hinted that anyone lived there at all. To Richard Henderson, it was a declaration of war. If the construction phase was an annoyance, the finished product was a scandal. Richard Henderson rallied the Crestview Valley Homeowners Association. They drafted a 60-page petition to the city council, citing aesthetic degradation, styling, and potential drainage hazards. Richard was relentless. He took photos of Beatrice's home every day, documenting the way the wild grasses on her roof dared to grow a few inches longer than the HOA's strict 2-inch lawn mandate. She is a menace to this community, Richard declared at a packed town hall meeting, slamming his fist on the podium. We live in a civilized society, not a post-apocalyptic wasteland. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't defend the look of her home. Instead, she pulled up a series of geological surveys on the projector. Mr. Henderson is concerned about property values, Beatrice said, her voice steady and echoing through the hushed hall. I am concerned about the soil composition of Blackwood Ridge. We have had 5 years of consecutive drought. The root systems holding that topsoil together are dying. If we get a severe atmospheric river, which meteorologists are predicting for this region, the sheer runoff will overwhelm your standard storm drains in minutes. My house is anchored to bedrock. Yours are sitting on a slip and slide. The room erupted into laughter. Stick to your bunker, Beatrice, someone yelled from the back. Leave the weather to the weathermen. The city council, bound by property laws, ultimately ruled in Beatrice's favor. Her home was unorthodox, but it vastly exceeded every safety and building code on the books. Defeated legally, the neighborhood resorted to complete social ostracization. Beatrice was a ghost in her own town, ignored at the grocery store, blocked in at the post office. Seneca said. The temperature hovered in the high 90s, baking the earth until it cracked like fragile porcelain. The lush green pine trees on Blackwood Ridge began to turn a sickly, brittle brown. Despite the drought, the residents of Crestview Valley kept their sprinklers running 24/7, desperately clinging to their green lawns, ignoring the municipal water warnings. Beatrice, meanwhile, relied entirely on her 10,000-gallon underground cistern, watching the mountain above her with a growing sense of dread. In late September, the atmospheric pressure suddenly plummeted. The stifling heat broke, replaced by a strange, suffocating humidity. The National Weather Service issued a rare urgent bulletin. A massive atmospheric river, carrying the moisture equivalent of the Amazon River, was stalling directly over the Pacific Northwest. It started on a Tuesday evening. It wasn't just rain, it was a biblical deluge. Water fell in thick, heavy sheets, instantly overwhelming the parched, baked soil. The earth, too dry to absorb the moisture, acted like a concrete ramp. Down in the valley, Dave and Chloe Whitmore laughed it off. Finally, free watering for the azaleas, Dave joked, posting a video of the downpour to his social media. But by midnight, the laughing stopped. The power grid failed first, plunging the opulent homes of Crestview Valley into pitch blackness. Then came the sirens, faint at first, then frantic. Inside her hillside cabin, Beatrice felt it before she heard it. Her home was a living extension of the mountain, and deep within the bedrock something was groaning. It was a deep, guttural vibration that vibrated through the soles of her boots. The dead, burnt root systems on the ridge above were giving way. Millions of tons of saturated earth, rock, and timber were losing their grip. Beatrice walked over to her control panel, engaged the hydraulic locks on her steel shutters, and turned on her external floodlights. She looked at the monitors displaying the live feed from her exterior cameras. What she saw made her blood run cold. Directly above Richard Henderson's six-bedroom colonial, the mountain was visibly moving. The catastrophic landslide had begun. The sound was not like thunder. It was like the tearing of the earth's very fabric. A low, grinding roar echoed through the pitch-black valley, drowning out the torrential hammering of the rain. Down in the cul-de-sac, Richard Henderson was violently awakened by the shaking of his bed. The luxury colonial home, built with premium lumber and imported Italian tile, was shuddering like a fragile toy. His wife Brenda screamed as the master bedroom window shattered inward, not from wind, but from a pressurized shockwave of displaced air pushing ahead of the landslide. Richard scrambled to his feet, grabbing a flashlight. Foes screamed as the mass, and their place was a 30-foot-high wall of churning, liquefied earth, jagged boulders, and the shattered remains of 100-year-old pine trees moving at highway speeds. Get out. Get out now. Richard bellowed, dragging Brenda down the hallway just as the rear wall of their home exploded. The mud flow didn't just push the house, it obliterated it. Hardwood floors splintered into shrapnel. Richard and Brenda barely made it out the front door, tumbling onto the flooded street just as their massive colonial collapsed entirely, swallowed by the relentless tide of black mud. A few doors down, Dave and Chloe Whitmore were trapped on their second-floor balcony. The lower level of their trendy, open-concept home was entirely submerged in thick, viscous debris. The imported Merlot Dave had sipped while mocking Beatrice was now floating in a toxic soup of ruptured sewer lines and crushed drywall. Panic consumed Crestview Valley. Sirens wailed in the distance, but they were useless. The only access road into the valley had been buried under 50 feet of rock. The neighborhood was entirely cut off. In the freezing rain, they were covered in mud, bleeding and shivering uncontrollably. They watched in horror as the mountain continued to groan. The first wave had been devastating, but the structural integrity of the upper ridge had completely failed. A second, far larger mudflow was building momentum. "We have to get to higher ground," Dave shouted over the roar of the storm. "There is no higher ground," Richard yelled back, his face pale, pointing wildly at the impenetrable wall of moving earth surrounding them. Then a blinding, piercing beam of light sliced through the deluge. It was coming from Lot 42. Beatrice's exterior floodlights, powered by an underground diesel generator, illuminated the hillside. And there, standing defiant against the apocalypse, was the cabin. It was performing exactly as Beatrice had engineered it to. Because the house was built into the hill with a reinforced aerodynamic earth-bermed roof, the landslide wasn't slamming into a flat wall. The millions of tons of mud, rock, and timber were ramping directly over the top of her home, harmlessly diverted down the sides by the massive concrete retaining walls. It was a submarine deep underwater, letting the current rush past. Richard stared at the fortress, the memory of his cruel town hall speech haunting him. "The bunker," he whispered. "Run," he screamed to the neighbors. "Run." The scramble up the steep, winding driveway of Lot 42 was less of a run and more of a desperate, clawing fight against gravity and liquefied earth. There were 32 of them in total, neighbors who had just hours before been sleeping soundly in silk sheets and custom-built king-size beds. Now, they were a bruised, bleeding mass of humanity, stumbling blindly through an apocalyptic downpour. The mud was thick and viscous, pulling at their ankles like wet cement. Richard dragged her upward, his lungs burning, his expensive silk pajamas plastered to his skin and heavy with freezing sludge. Behind them, Dave and Chloe Whitmore were helping an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, whose hip had been dislocated when a retaining wall collapsed into her living room. Every step was agonizing. Every second was measured in the terrifying guttural roar of Blackwood Ridge tearing itself apart. The second wave, currently building momentum near the summit, sounded like a fleet of freight trains descending from the heavens. Pine trees that had stood for a century were snapping like dry toothpicks. Boulders the size of minivans were grinding against one another, creating sparks that flashed eerily in the pitch-black night. They reached the summit of the driveway. The floodlights from Beatrice's property cut through the sheets of rain, illuminating the brutalist concrete facade. The cabin, with its earth-burmede aerodynamic roof, was taking the brunt of the mountain's fury and deflecting it. Torrents of black mud and shattered timber were ramping up over the reinforced turf roof and sliding harmlessly down the engineered concrete spillways on either side. It was a submarine anchored to the ocean floor while a hurricane raged above. Richard slammed his raw, bleeding fists against the heavy, blast-resistant steel door. The metal was freezing and unyielding. "Beatrice," he screamed, his voice cracking, entirely drowned out by the tempest behind him. He pounded again, leaving smears of blood on the gray steel. "Beatrice, please. We're sorry. Please open the door. We're going to die out here." Of less than a minute away. It would hit the cul-de-sac and sweep up everything in its path, including the driveway they were standing on. He closed his eyes. The bitter, suffocating weight of his own arrogance crashed down on him. He had drafted petitions to ruin this woman. He had stood at a podium and called her a menace. He had allowed teenagers to throw eggs at this very door. Why would she ever open it? Why would she save the monsters who had made her a pariah? He braced himself, pulling Brenda tight against his chest, waiting for the mountain to claim them. Then a sound cut through the chaos, a sharp, mechanical hiss of releasing pneumatic pressure. Heavy steel deadbolts, thick as a man's forearm, retracted with a series of heavy vibrating clunks. The impenetrable iron door swung outward, pushing against the howling wind. Standing in the entryway, bathed in the warm golden glow of emergency LED lighting, was Beatrice Gallagher. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't smiling. She wore her scuffed steel-toed boots, heavy canvas work pants, and a high-visibility tactical jacket. Her face was a mask of pure, calculated focus. But it possessed a commanding authority that cut straight through the panic. The neighbor surged forward, a tidal wave of relief and sobbing. They flooded into the decontamination airlock, collapsing onto the dry, heated concrete floors. As the last person, Dave Whitmore, carrying Mrs. Gable crossed the threshold, Beatrice slammed her entire body weight against the steel door. The apocalyptic roar of the landslide was reduced to a dull, muffled thud behind 3 feet of steel-reinforced concrete and 30 feet of bedrock. The air inside was warm, dry, and smelled faintly of ozone and sterile medical supplies from the heavy-duty filtration system. Richard sat on the floor, his back against the cold steel of the door, hyperventilating as he stared down the main hallway. He expected to see a cramped, paranoid prepper's hoard stacks of baked beans and ammunition in a claustrophobic tunnel. Instead, he saw an arc. The lower holding area of the Doomsday Dungeon was a cavernous, brilliantly lit space. But it was the precise, meticulous setup that made Richard's blood run cold with realization. Lined up in perfect military rows were heavy-duty folding cots. Not just a few. At the foot of each cot was a gray plastic bin containing thermal mylar blankets, a fresh set of heavy fleece sweatpants and shirts in varying sizes, and a pair of thick wool socks. Against the far wall, industrial first aid stations were bolted to the concrete, alongside crates of bottled water, electrolyte powders, and high-calorie emergency rations. This wasn't a bunker built for a paranoid hermit. It was a rescue center engineered specifically for the population of the Crestview Valley cul-de-sac. Beatrice didn't give them time to process. She moved through the room with the efficiency of a combat medic. Chloe, I need you to open the red bins. They contain sterile saline and dolls. I need to clean these lacerations. For the next 2 hours, the bunker was a flurry of focused, quiet activity. Beatrice sutured Brenda's feet, set Mrs. Gable's hip with astonishing precision, and checked every single resident for concussions. She moved among the people who had mocked her, touching them with gentle, steady, and capable hands. Finally, as the exhaustion settled in and the neighbors lay wrapped in thermal blankets on their designated cots, a heavy, profound silence fell over the room. Above them, they could feel the faint, rhythmic vibrations of millions of tons of mud and rock burying their former lives. Chloe Whitmore sat on the edge of a cot, clutching a steaming thermos of tea Beatrice had handed her. She stared at the meticulously organized room, then looked up at the 62-year-old engineer. Beatrice, Chloe stammered, her voice thick with tears and shame. You had exactly 32 cots. You had clothes in our sizes. You knew. Beatrice was at the metal sink, washing the blood and mud from her hands with harsh iodine soap. She didn't look up. I read the geological surveys. I knew the drought was killing the root systems, holding the topsoil to the bedrock. It wasn't a matter of if the ridge would collapse under an atmospheric river. But when Richard Henderson stood up, his legs were shaking, and he looked 10 years older than he had that morning. He walked slowly toward the center of the room, standing before Beatrice. You knew it was coming, Richard said, his voice a ragged whisper. And you knew our houses wouldn't survive. So you built this. For us? Even after everything we did to you. even after the town hall. The petitions? Beatrice finally turned around. She dried her hands on a rough towel. Her eyes, usually so guarded and unreadable, were shimmering with a deep, unresolved pain. 32 years ago, Beatrice began, her voice echoing softly off the concrete walls, I lived in a beautiful subdivision in the Midwest with my husband, Arthur. We didn't have a basement. We didn't think we needed one. When the sirens went off for a Category 4 tornado, we ran to our neighbor's house. They had a reinforced storm cellar. She paused, taking a slow, shaky breath. The entire room hung on her every word. We banged on their doors, Beatrice continued, looking directly into Richard's eyes. They were inside, but they were terrified. They thought they didn't have enough room. They thought if they opened the hatch, the wind would compromise their safety. They looked at us through the reinforced glass, and they locked the heavy steel door. Chloe let out a muffled gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. The tornado took our house off its foundation, Beatrice said, her tone flattening out into a chilling factual drone. It took Arthur. I survived because I was thrown into a drainage ditch. He died on their doorstep, banging on the metal. Beatrice tossed the towel onto the counter and looked around at the 32 faces staring back at her in stunned, horrified silence. I swore on his grave, Beatrice said fiercely. I swore on his grave. The weight of his cruelty juxtaposed against the sheer magnitude of her grace was too much to bear. I am so sorry, Richard wept, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. I am so sorry, Beatrice. Slowly, Beatrice walked over to him. She didn't offer a platitude. She didn't tell him it was okay, because it hadn't been okay. Instead, she placed a firm, grounding hand on his shoulder. But the walls are holding. We are alive. We are alive. That is the only thing that matters tonight. They remained sealed inside the earth-burned fortress for 2 full days. Above them, the atmospheric river unleashed a biblical deluge, washing away every trace of the opulent Crestview Valley. Millions of dollars in real estate, luxury cars and manicured lawns were pulverized and buried under 50 feet of debris. When the storm finally broke and the National Guard rescue helicopters descended into the valley, They reported a total loss of the subdivision. There was nothing but a massive flattened plain of gray mud and shattered timber. A massive gray concrete structure. "32 survivors walked out into the blinding sunlight, squinting at the devastation, entirely unharmed. Beatrice Gallagher stood at the threshold, watching them go. She was no longer the neighborhood joke, the crazy hermit, or the eyesore on the hill. She was the architect of their salvation, the woman who had transformed her own profound tragedy into a fortress of life, proving to a fractured community that true security isn't found in keeping people out, but in having the strength to let them in. If you were captivated by Beatrice's incredible story of foresight and survival, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell for more thrilling, real-life stories of human resilience. What would you have done in Beatrice's shoes? Would you have opened the door? Let us know in the comments below.